At 4:38 in the morning, the red folder was already on the Pope's desk. No one admitted placing it there. Not the secretary who unlocked the corridor before dawn. Not the Swiss guard who had stood at the inner entrance since midnight. Not the young Monsignor assigned to the night shift in the Apostolic Palace. Yet there it was, a narrow folder, dark red, tied with a thin black cord, lying beside a cup of cold coffee and an open copy of the Gospel of Matthew. On the first page, written in a small, deliberate hand, were only 4 words. The world has stopped listening. Pope Leo XIV read the sentence twice. Then he closed his eyes. Outside, Rome was still asleep. The dome of St. Peter's was a shadow against the pale sky, and the streets around the Vatican were empty, except for delivery vans, police lights, and pilgrims who had arrived too early because they did not know where else to bring their prayers. Inside the palace, the old stones held their silence. They had heard too many secrets, too many compromises, too many careful phrases prepared for the sake of diplomacy. But that morning was not going to belong to diplomacy. It was going to belong to a wound. The folder contained 47 pages, not a doctrine, not an encyclical, not an official decree. It was something stranger. A collection of letters, internal reports, intercepted public statements, testimonies from missionaries, and handwritten notes from ordinary people who had asked the same question in different languages. Why does no one listen anymore? A mother from Lampedusa wrote about a migrant child who stopped speaking after 3 days at sea. A young man from Chicago wrote that his parish had split over politics, and the Eucharist no longer felt like communion, but like a line of people silently judging one another. A bishop from the Amazon wrote that companies had promised development to indigenous villages, then left rivers poisoned and families divided. A nun from Manila wrote that teenagers came to confession not because they wanted forgiveness, but because they wanted someone to look them in the eye without mocking their pain. A retired diplomat wrote one sentence at the bottom of his letter. Holy Father, the world is not only divided, it is deaf. Leo XIV placed the last page down and remained still. He did not ring for an aide. He did not summon a meeting. He did not ask the Secretariat of State to prepare cautious language. Those who knew him well understood this silence. It was not hesitation, it was preparation. They thought silence meant weakness. It was prayer. At 6:05 a.m., his secretary, Father Matteo Arce, entered the room carrying the morning schedule. The Pope was standing by the window looking toward the square. Holy Father, Matteo said softly, the audience begins at 10. Leo did not turn immediately. Cancel the prepared text. Matteo stopped off. All of it. All of it. There are delegations waiting, diplomats, journalists, several bishops from Europe. The communications office expects the text before 8. The Pope turned now. His face was tired, but his eyes were clear. Then they will expect something they will not receive. Matteo looked at the red folder on the desk. Is this about the letters? It is about the wound under the letters. Should I notify the press office? No, if I notify them, they will polish the message until it no longer bleeds. That sentence told Matteo everything. This would not be a routine speech. It would not be a gentle reflection on world peace, softened by ceremonial phrases. It would be the kind of papal address that makes men in offices reach for telephones, the kind that begins as a homily and becomes an earthquake. Before we go further, understand what this story is. A dramatized, Vatican-style documentary scenario, shaped like a cinematic moral investigation. It is not a claim that an actual Vatican document was issued this morning. It is a narrative built to explore the spiritual questions many Catholics feel pressing upon the modern world. Dialogue, human dignity, technology, family, justice, and the crisis of meaning. At 9:54 a.m., St. Peter's Square was already alive. Pilgrims waved small flags. Sisters adjusted their veils in the morning light. Journalists checked their audio. Families lifted children onto their shoulders. The crowd expected encouragement. Something about peace. Something about prayer. Something that would sound comforting but leave the political world untouched. Inside the Vatican, several officials assumed the same thing. They had seen the prepared draft. It was balanced, careful, useful. It mentioned the need for dialogue, the importance of dignity, the suffering of migrants, and the role of faith in public life. It contained no sentence that would cause a government to complain or a financial donor to hesitate. But the draft was no longer in the Pope's hand. The red folder was. At 10:03, Leo XIV stepped before the crowd. He wore no elaborate vestment, only white. He looked smaller than the basilica behind him, yet the square seemed to bend around his silence. He did not begin with the usual ceremonial cadence. He did not thank the delegations one by one. He did not praise the city. He placed both hands on the lectern and looked out at the thousands before him. Then he said, "We have forgotten how to listen." The translators froze for a fraction of a second. In the press section, heads lifted. The Pope continued, "We speak quickly. We condemn quickly. We wound quickly. We call it conviction, but sometimes it is only fear wearing a noble mask. We call it truth, but sometimes it is only pride looking for a pulpit. We call it dialogue, but too often we mean victory." The square shifted, not with noise, with recognition. He did not speak like a man reading a text. He spoke like a man who had spent the night with the pain of the world spread open before him. "For years," he said, "humanity has built louder instruments of communication and weaker habits of communion. We can reach the other side of the planet in seconds, but we cannot bear to sit at the same table with someone who disagrees with us. We have satellites in the sky and suspicion in the heart. We have instant messages and ancient loneliness." A cardinal standing near the side entrance lowered his eyes. A journalist from Argentina whispered, "This is not the draft." "No, it was not." Leo's voice remained calm, but something under it began to burn. The first collapse of a civilization is not always economic. It is not always military. Sometimes it begins when words stop being bridges and become knives. That was the first wound he named, the collapse of dialogue. But not as a sociologist, not as a commentator, as a pastor who had smelled the smoke. To understand why this mattered, you have to go back decades before the white cassock, before the balcony, before the crowds. Go back to the Amazon. Go back to the river. The Ucayali moved like a brown serpent through the heat, carrying fishing boats, floating leaves, fuel cans, children's laughter, and the quiet grief of villages that had learned not to expect help from the powerful. The young Father Leo, long before anyone imagined him as Pope, had walked muddy paths with a notebook in his pocket and a wooden rosary wrapped around his hand. He listened more than he spoke. That was what people remembered. He listened to mothers who could not read, but understood injustice better than ministers in suits. He listened to men whose land had been taken by legal documents they had never seen. He listened to children who learned early that hunger is not an abstraction, but a sound in the stomach. One afternoon, under a roof of tin hammered by rain, a woman named Dominga told him, "Father, the world does not hate us. It does not even see us. That is worse." He never forgot that. Years later, as Pope, when diplomats spoke to him about migration flows, pressures, numbers, and regional burdens, Leo remembered Dominga's face. He remembered a child with fever lying in a hammock. He remembered a riverbank where men talked about profits while mothers counted the cost in graves. So, when he stood in St. Peter's Square and spoke about dialogue, he was not asking people to be polite. He was asking them to see. Dialogue is not weakness, he told the crowd. It is not surrender. It is not moral confusion. Dialogue is the courage to approach the wound without a weapon in the hand. The sentence crossed the square. In Rome, several newsrooms clipped it within minutes. But inside the Vatican, it hit a different nerve. Because everyone knew dialogue had become a word used by everyone and practiced by almost no one. Governments invoked it while bombing. Parties invoked it while humiliating opponents. Church factions invoked it while preparing documents against one another in secret. Leo knew this, and he said so. We cannot preach reconciliation while rewarding contempt. We cannot bless peace while profiting from division. We cannot ask the world to disarm if our own tongues remain sharpened. This was no longer soft. This was diagnosis. Then came the second wound, the culture of discard. The Pope let the phrase hang in the air before unfolding it. Today, he said, the unborn child is discarded in silence. The elderly person is discarded in loneliness. The migrant is discarded at borders. The poor are discarded in statistics. The sick are discarded when they become expensive. The prisoner is discarded when his name becomes only his crime. The lonely are discarded because their pain does not trend. A murmur moved through the square. Some nodded, some stiffened, some felt accused, some felt seen. Leo did not soften. A society that measures the value of life by usefulness has already begun to forget the face of God. Behind the public platform, a Vatican communications aide looked at another and whispered, "Governments will react." The other answered, "Not only governments," because the Pope was not speaking only to the world outside the Church. He was speaking inward too. He knew Catholic institutions could speak beautifully of dignity while treating their employees as invisible. He knew dioceses could defend life in public statements while neglecting mothers in crisis. He knew Catholic hospitals could be caught between mission and financial logic. He knew schools could teach morality while ignoring the poor students who could no longer pay. So he said, the Church must not denounce discard from a distance. She must ask where she herself has learned to discard. That was the sentence that changed the tone inside the Curia. It was not an attack. It was a mirror. A mirror is more dangerous than an accusation because no one can claim the face reflected is someone else's. By noon, the first internal messages began to move through encrypted channels. Did he clear this with doctrine? No. Was the Secretariat informed? No. Will the full text be released? There is no full text. That was the problem. When a pope reads a prepared document, officials can frame it. When a pope speaks from the wound, the frame breaks. Outside the Vatican, ordinary people understood faster than experts did. In Nairobi, a Catholic teacher paused a live stream and replayed the line about discarded loneliness 3 times. In Manila, a mother forwarded the clip to her daughters and wrote, "This is why we still pray." In Warsaw, a conservative priest watched uneasily, but could not deny the power of the words. In Buenos Aires, a homeless shelter printed the transcript before evening and taped it beside the kitchen door. The world was listening, but the Vatican was calculating. That afternoon, in a narrow meeting room behind the Secretariat of State, 7 officials gathered without formal summons. No one wanted the minutes, no one wanted records. A senior Monsignor placed his phone face down and said, "This cannot become the governing style." A younger priest asked, speaking directly, improvising doctrine in front of cameras. He did not change doctrine. He changed pressure. That was true. The Pope had not issued a decree. He had done something more difficult to contain. He had shifted the moral weight. He had made silence look guilty. At 3:17 p.m., the press office released a cautious statement saying, "The Holy Father's remarks reflected a pastoral meditation on the need for renewed human fraternity." The phrase was smooth, too smooth. By then, the clips had already escaped. One line dominated the headlines. Words have become knives. But the red folder contained more than dialogue. It contained the next battlefield, technology. 2 days later, Leo XIV convened a smaller meeting in the Clementine Hall. The guest list was unusual. Cardinals, yes. Bishops, yes. But also a neuroscientist from Belgium, a Catholic software engineer from Bangalore, a mother whose teenage son had taken his own life after online humiliation, a former social media executive, and a young woman from Korea who ran a ministry for lonely students. The old Curia men did not like the guest list. It smelled too much like the world. Leo entered without ceremony and placed the red folder on the table. "We speak of the digital world as though it were only a tool," he began. "But tools shape the hands that use them. Platforms shape attention. Algorithms shape desire. The question is not only what technology allows us to do. The question is what technology trains us to love." No one interrupted. The former executive looked down. The mother wiped her eyes. Leo continued, "A machine can count engagement. It cannot measure the dignity of a soul. A system can predict behavior. It cannot understand repentance. Artificial intelligence can imitate language. It cannot forgive. It cannot adore. It cannot kneel before the mystery of God." A cardinal whispered to his aide, "This will be quoted everywhere." It was, but Leo was not interested in slogans. He asked for testimony. The mother spoke first. Her son had been 14. A gentle boy, a musician. He had been mocked online after a video was edited and shared by classmates. The humiliation spread in hours. Adults called it bullying. She called it crucifixion without nails. "He died," she said, "because 1,000 people laughed, and no one stood close enough to say stop." The room was silent. Leo closed his eyes. Then the engineer from Bangalore spoke about addictive design, children trained to crave affirmation, and the invisible economy of attention. "Holy Father," she said, "the product is not the app. The product is the person's focus." Leo wrote that sentence down. Later in the chapel, he repeated it quietly. The product is the person's focus. The next morning, the Pope spoke again, this time to young people. Do not give your soul to a machine that profits from your restlessness, he said. Do not confuse being seen with being loved. Do not confuse constant connection with communion. There are moments when the holiest act is to turn off the screen and look into the face beside you. The response from young Catholics was immediate and divided. Some called it the most honest thing they had heard from a church leader. Others said the Pope did not understand modern life. But the deeper reaction came from parents. Thousands wrote to the Vatican, not polished letters, desperate letters. My daughter no longer speaks at dinner. My son sleeps with his phone under his pillow. My children believe silence is punishment. I do not know how to raise a Catholic family inside a digital storm. Leo read a selection of those letters late into the night. At 1:42 a.m., he wrote in the margin of one page, "The next mission field is attention." That line later became the hidden spine of his next teaching. Because if the church cannot help people recover attention, it cannot help them pray. And if people cannot pray, they cannot resist manipulation. Not political manipulation, not commercial manipulation, not spiritual manipulation. This is where the investigative thread widened. A private study commissioned quietly by the Vatican showed that many Catholic youth ministries had become dependent on the same attention economy that wounded young people. Short clips, emotional manipulation, fear-based hooks, spectacle, viral outrage, personality cults. Leo saw the danger. We cannot evangelize by baptizing the machinery of addiction, he told a group of communications leaders. If our methods train the soul to crave noise, how will that soul ever hear God? That sentence irritated several Catholic media figures. It also liberated many pastors who had sensed the same problem, but lacked the language to name it. Then came the third battlefield, the family. Not as a slogan, as a sanctuary under siege. The source text had spoken with force about the family, the body, and identity. In the new formula, Leo's teaching unfolded through a single case file in the red folder. House 12, Rosario District. It came from a parish on the edge of a Latin American city. A priest had sent photos of 12 families, living in one apartment building. In 5 years, the building had seen 3 divorces, 2 teenage pregnancies, 1 suicide attempt, 2 elderly residents abandoned by children who had moved away, and 1 boy who had disappeared into a gang after his father left. On the last page, the priest wrote, "Holy Father, the family does not collapse all at once. It collapses room by room." Leo carried that line into his next address. The family, he said, is not an old slogan. It is the first place where a human being learns whether the world is safe, whether love is faithful, whether sacrifice has meaning, whether life is received as a gift. He paused, and when the family breaks, the wound is not private. It becomes social, it becomes cultural, it becomes spiritual. This was not a condemnation of wounded families. Leo was careful, more careful than his critics expected. He spoke of divorced parents who still loved their children with heroic patience. He spoke of single mothers carrying more weight than any institution acknowledged. He spoke of grandparents who became the last guardians of faith in homes where parents no longer prayed. He did not romanticize pain, but he refused to call confusion liberation. The church must accompany every wounded home, he said. But accompaniment is not the art of pretending wounds are not wounds. Mercy does not erase truth. Truth without mercy becomes a stone. Mercy without truth becomes fog. That line circulated widely. Truth without mercy becomes a stone. Mercy without truth becomes fog. It became one of the defining formulas of the entire address. Then Leo turned toward the body, not with cold ideology, with trembling seriousness. The body is not raw material for the will, he said. It is not a prison to be escaped, or a machine to be redesigned according to the anxiety of the moment. The body is a language. It speaks of gift, limit, difference, communion, dependence, and destiny. A group of theologians later said this was one of the most important anthropological sentences of his pontificate. But the reaction was fierce. Some media accused him of being harsh toward people struggling with identity. Some traditionalist commentators said he had not been harsh enough. Leo, as usual, disappointed both groups. He refused cruelty. He refused confusion. He asked bishops to open centers of pastoral accompaniment where young people struggling with identity, loneliness, and bodily anguish could be welcomed without mockery and guided without lies. Do not abandon them to ideology, he told pastors. Do not abandon them to shame. Do not abandon them to the market. Walk with them toward the truth that heals. There it was again, truth and healing, not one without the other. Meanwhile, in the Vatican, pressure mounted. A coalition of diplomats worried the Pope's words on family and anthropology would strain relationships with several governments. A cluster of donors worried about statements on wealth. Technology leaders politely requested clarification. Activists from every side claimed the Pope had either betrayed them or validated them. Leo did not issue clarifications. Instead, he visited a home. No cameras had been scheduled. No formal announcement was prepared. At 7:11 one evening, he entered a small shelter run by sisters outside Rome. The shelter cared for pregnant women, abandoned by partners, migrant mothers, and elderly women with nowhere to go. One young woman, barely 20, held a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket. She did not know how to address the Pope, so she simply said, "I almost did not keep him." Leo looked at the child for a long time. Then he said, "And now the world has a face it would have lost." The sister beside him wept. That line was not in any document. It appeared only because someone in the room later remembered it and repeated it. But it became the emotional center of the next section of his message. Every life is not an argument. Every life is a face. From there, Leo moved into the fourth battlefield, money and global injustice. The red folder contained pages from the Amazon, from Africa, from refugee camps, from Catholic economists, and from parish kitchens. But it also contained something else. 3 anonymous memos from within Vatican financial circles, warning that the Pope's language about inequality could alienate strategic partners. Strategic partners. Leo circled the phrase. Beside it, he wrote one question. Partners in what? On the following Sunday, he preached one of the sharpest homilies of his early pontificate. Wealth is not evil when it serves life, he said. But wealth becomes demonic when it demands that life serve it. The basilica became still. He continued, "We speak of markets as though they were weather, as though hunger were rain, as though inequality were gravity. No, these are not impersonal forces. Behind every system are human choices. Behind every policy are moral assumptions. Behind every budget is a theology, even if it does not dare to name God." That sentence disturbed political leaders more than any explicit partisan statement could have done. Because it cut deeper. Leo was not telling people which party to support. He was asking what image of the human person ruled their decisions. Then he named the contradiction. We invest in weapons and call it security. We abandon schools and call it austerity. We exploit labor and call it efficiency. We pollute rivers and call it development. We ignore the poor and call it realism. The square erupted in applause. Inside certain offices, men frowned. A European ambassador later told a colleague, "He is dangerous because he does not speak like a politician. He speaks like someone who believes moral language is real." Exactly. That was the problem. Leo believed words like justice, life, truth, mercy, poverty, and peace still meant something. He also believed Catholics had grown too comfortable outsourcing conscience. The Christian, he said, cannot leave public life to the loudest, and then complain that society has no soul. A hidden faith becomes a private comfort. A living faith becomes public responsibility. But he warned against hatred. Do not enter public life as conquerors, he said. Enter as servants. Do not use faith as a hammer for your enemies. Use it as light for the common good. That balance frustrated ideologues. It comforted the faithful. The fifth battlefield was culture, education, media, narratives, the invisible shaping of conscience. Here the investigative tone sharpened. A report reached the Pope's desk from a commission of Catholic educators. It showed that in many countries, parents had lost almost all influence over the moral and spiritual formation of their children, not because law had formally removed them, but because screens, schools, entertainment, and peer culture formed the imagination faster than families could respond. At the bottom of the report, a teacher had written, "The child comes home speaking a language the parents did not teach." Leo read the sentence aloud in a meeting with educators. No one spoke. He looked around the room. "This is not merely about curriculum," he said. "It is about who is discipling the imagination." That phrase became another key. Who is discipling the imagination? In a later address, he warned, "A culture can persecute faith without closing a single church. It can simply teach children to laugh at holiness, distrust their parents, mock sacrifice, and treat desire as destiny. He did not call for fear. He called for formation. Parents, he said, must reclaim the home as the first school of wisdom, not by panic, not by control alone, by presence, by prayer, by shared meals, by stories of saints, by honest conversations, by examples strong enough to survive adolescent rebellion. Do not merely forbid darkness, he said. Light a better fire. Catholic educators responded strongly. Some schools began revisiting curricula. Some youth ministers changed their methods. Families formed small groups for prayer and discussion. But there was resistance. Some said the Pope was encouraging cultural war. He answered with one sentence during a private meeting: "The war already exists. The question is whether Christians will fight with hatred or witness with holiness." Then came the sixth battlefield, the ecological wound. Leo did not approach creation care as fashion. He tied it to sin. An exploited river is a theological scandal, he said. A burned forest is not only environmental loss, it is a wound in the common home entrusted by God. Some expected him to blame only industry. He did not. He blamed greed in every form: corporate greed, consumer greed, political greed, personal greed. We cannot condemn pollution while worshiping convenience, he said. We cannot weep over poisoned water while living as though every desire must be delivered to our door by morning. That line stung because it did not let ordinary people hide behind distant villains. The Pope's ecological message was not soft. It was penitential. He called for confession not only of personal sins, but of civilizational habits. What have we consumed without gratitude? What have we wasted without sorrow? What have we taken from the poor by taking too much from the earth? In a small symbolic gesture, he ordered that a garden within the Vatican be dedicated to communities harmed by environmental destruction. No statue, no marble inscription, only soil from affected regions, planted with trees from those lands. At dawn, he prayed there with indigenous leaders, scientists, and children. No long speech, only Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and all it holds. Then came the final battlefield, the eclipse of God. It was the deepest wound. Everything else flowed from it. A world that forgets God forgets the person. A world that forgets the person builds systems without mercy. A world without mercy calls death progress and loneliness freedom. Leo understood this not from books alone, but from confessionals, hospitals, letters, and nights in prayer. He had seen people with everything and no meaning, students with degrees and despair, families with homes and no communion, cities with lights and no silence, churches with programs and no adoration. So one evening, at a vigil in St. Peter's, he turned off the prepared music. For 6 minutes, the basilica was silent. No chant, no organ, no instruction, only silence. At first, people shifted uncomfortably. Then they settled. Then some began to cry. After the silence, Leo said, "Modern man fears silence because silence tells him the truth. He is not enough for himself." That sentence did not trend as much as the sharper political lines. But for many, it was the line that changed them. The Pope continued, "We are not saved by noise. We are not healed by distraction. We are not converted by outrage. We are healed when the heart becomes quiet enough to hear God calling it by name." He asked every Catholic home to recover one daily act of silence, not as a technique, not as wellness, as prayer. A father in Vietnam wrote to the Vatican a month later. "We turned off every screen for 10 minutes after dinner. My son hated it. Then he asked if we could do it again." A mother in Mexico wrote, "Silence showed me how angry I was. Then prayer showed me I was not abandoned." A seminarian in Nigeria wrote, "I realized I wanted to speak about God more than I wanted to be with Him." These letters were added to the red folder. The folder grew thicker, not because the crisis had ended, because the Church was beginning to answer. Still, opposition came. Some Vatican officials argued the Pope's messages had become too broad, too intense, too difficult to manage. A senior cardinal warned, "Holiness, you are speaking to everything at once: economy, media, technology, family, ecology, migration, spirituality. People may lose the central message." Leo answered quietly, "The central message is that Christ is Lord of all of it." That ended the meeting, but not the resistance. A draft counter-memo circulated among officials. It suggested that future papal addresses be routed through a theological and diplomatic harmonization committee. In ordinary language, control. The proposal reached the Pope. He read it. Then he wrote across the top, "The gospel was not harmonized before the cross." He returned to He returned it unsigned. The next morning he delivered the final address of what journalists had begun calling the week of the red folder. The square was full again, not because people understood everything, because they sensed something real was happening. Leo began with the image of two paths. One path, he said, promises life without sacrifice, freedom without truth, progress without conscience, power without service, and peace without conversion. It is wide, it is applauded, it is advertised everywhere. He paused. The other path is narrow. It asks for repentance. It asks for courage. It asks us to defend life when life is inconvenient, to welcome the stranger when fear is easier, to speak truth when silence is profitable, to pray when distraction is pleasant, to love when hatred is fashionable. The crowd listened. This second path is the path of Christ. Then he lifted the red folder. For the first time, people saw it. This folder contains letters from the world's wounds, he said. Mothers, migrants, teachers, bishops, prisoners, young people, missionaries, the poor, the lonely, those who still believe, those who almost cannot believe anymore. He held it close. I have read them. I cannot unread them. A line like a bell. I cannot unread them. He continued. And because I cannot unread them, I cannot offer you a comfortable gospel. I cannot offer you a church that blesses every age and never judges it. I cannot offer you peace built on silence. I can only offer Christ, crucified and risen, who wounds our illusions in order to heal our souls. The square was silent. No applause yet. People knew he was moving toward something. This is not a call to despair. This is a call to responsibility. The future is not written only in parliaments, boardrooms, laboratories, media studios, or Vatican offices. The future is written in homes where forgiveness is chosen, in parishes where the poor are welcomed, in classrooms where truth is taught with love, in hospitals where the sick are treated as persons, in digital spaces where dignity is defended, in silence where God is heard again. He lowered the folder. Then came the final sentence, the one that would echo beyond the week. The world will not be saved by louder voices. It will be saved by converted hearts that finally learn to listen. This time the applause did not explode. It rose slowly, like a tide, like prayer, like people realizing they were not watching a performance but receiving a task. That night, Leo turned to his desk. The red folder lay open. He took out a blank sheet and wrote a final note, not for publication, but for himself. Lord, do not let me speak so much of the wounded world that I forget to kneel for it. Then he went to the chapel. No cameras, no aids, no sound but the old floor beneath his steps. He placed the red folder at the foot of the crucifix, and for a long time he said nothing, because after every true word, the church must return to prayer, and after every wound is named, mercy must begin its work. But the story did not end with the applause. 3 days later, at 2:23 in the afternoon, a second envelope arrived. It was smaller than the red folder, sealed in plain brown paper, and carried by a messenger from the Vatican mail office, who seemed almost embarrassed to deliver it. The envelope had been sent from a prison outside Naples. The handwriting was uneven. The name on the return line had been crossed out twice. Father Matteo brought it to the Pope during a short break between meetings. Another letter, he said. Leo looked at it and reached for the letter opener. Inside was a single page. Holy Father, I am not a theologian. I am not a good man. I am serving 22 years. I have done things I cannot undo. But yesterday, in the prison chapel, a volunteer played your words about listening. You said the world will not be saved by louder voices, but by converted hearts. I do not know if my heart can still be converted, but for the first time in years, I wanted to be silent without hating myself. Pray for me. I do not ask you to excuse me. I ask you to believe that God can still find me. Leo read it once, then again. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside the red folder. That evening, he changed his schedule. Instead of receiving an international delegation that wanted photographs, he went to Rabibia prison without advance publicity. The guards were surprised. The chaplain was unprepared. The prisoners, many of whom had only seen the Pope on screens, stood in stunned silence as he entered the chapel. He did not give a speech from the front. He sat among them. That was the first shock. A Pope sitting in the fourth row of a prison chapel, beside men whose names had appeared in police records, court transcripts, and the nightmares of families they had wounded. One inmate asked him, "Holy Father, do you think we deserve mercy?" Leo turned to him. "No, biki. Alma, no," he said gently. "Mercy is not deserved. That is why it is mercy." The room went still. Then the Pope added, "But mercy does not erase truth. If you have destroyed, you must tell the truth. If you have wounded, you must not ask the wounded to pretend. If you have sinned, you must not use God's compassion as a hiding place. Mercy is not an escape from responsibility. It is the strength to finally face it." A man in the back began to cry into his hands. This prison visit became the hidden key to the whole message. Because Leo was not preaching a soft gospel. He was not saying dialogue means avoiding judgment. He was not saying love means pretending evil is not evil. He was saying something harder. The person is greater than his worst act, but the worst act must still be named. The sinner is not disposable, but sin must not be romanticized. Justice without mercy becomes revenge. Mercy without justice becomes another wound. When the visit became public, the reactions were immediate. Some accused him of sentimentalizing crime. Others accused him of not being forgiving enough. Once again, he was attacked from both sides. But the prisoners understood. The victims' families understood too, more than many expected. One mother, whose son had been murdered, wrote to the Vatican, "Holy Father, I am not ready to forgive. Maybe I never will be. But I heard you say mercy does not ask the victim to disappear. For that, I thank you." Leo placed that letter in the folder as well. Now the red folder was no longer only a record of global wounds. It had become an altar of unfinished conversions. And that is where the final turn of the story began. Because in the days that followed, parishes around the world began creating what they called tables of listening. The idea was simple. One evening each week, the church hall would open not for debate, not for politics, not for winning arguments, but for testimony. Migrants sat beside citizens afraid of migration. Parents sat beside teenagers they no longer understood. Victims of gossip sat beside people who had spread it. Young Catholics sat beside priests they felt had ignored them. Conservatives and progressives sat in the same room, not to dilute truth, but to remember that the other person still had a face. The rules were written on a single page. Speak truthfully. Do not interrupt. Do not reduce the other to a label. Do not use scripture as a weapon. Do not confuse listening with agreement. End in prayer. In some places it failed. People shouted. Some walked out. Some pastors shut it down after one meeting because the pain was too raw. But in other places something holy happened. A parish in Seoul reported that young people returned after years away, not because every question was solved, but because someone finally let them speak without mockery. A community in Colombia reported that families divided by politics prayed together for the first time in months. A Catholic school in Kenya began each week with 10 minutes of silence and one testimony from a student about an unseen struggle. The red folder had become a movement, not official, not branded, not controlled, alive. And that frightened the systems that depended on people never truly meeting one another. At the next internal Vatican briefing, one official warned, "Holy Father, these tables of listening could become unpredictable." Leo answered, "So was Pentecost." Another said, "There will be mistakes." There were mistakes among the apostles too. And what if people say things that are wrong? Then we teach, but first we listen long enough to understand what wound is speaking through the error. No one had an answer. This was the heart of Leo's revolution. Not noise, not vague tolerance, not cheap unity, a deeper thing. Truth spoken only after the human person had been seen. That night, he returned once more to the chapel. The red folder was heavier now. Letters from prisoners, mothers, migrants, teachers, priests, skeptics, and children pressed against its cord. He knelt. "Lord," he whispered, "teach your church to listen without surrendering truth and to speak truth without crushing the wounded." The candle beside the crucifix flickered. The room remained silent, but this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt like a beginning. If this story challenged you, stay with us. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of this message struck your heart most. Dialogue, the family, technology, migrants, justice, creation, or the silence of prayer. Share this with someone who is tired of noise and still searching for truth. And subscribe for more Vatican-style documentary reflections on faith, history, power, and the hope that refuses to die. The red folder had been opened. The world had been named. Now, the listening had to begin.